Welcome to the My Innovation Coach training webinar, Innovation is a Team Sport, Part 3. So this is the last part of this three-part series on team dynamics and emphasizing the importance of teams in innovation success. And so in the first two webinars, we covered basically these four topics. I introduced you to a useful mental model, which we'll go back to here in a minute. I spent a lot of time on culture in part one because we really can't talk about team performance without thinking about the overall culture within the organization, how that permeates down to the team level, how important that is. And then in part one, we also talked about four different options for organizing your teams. Then in part two, we talked about two of the four topics on team dynamics, and I'm going to pick up where I left off from part two in this session, as well as then talk about some topics related to supporting teams. So I want to go back to our mental model that I introduced at the very beginning in part one. And the idea here is that a project starts, it unfolds, and then of course it ends, hopefully. And that project sits within the context of these four spaces, if you want to think of them that way. The first is the culture within the organization, and that's, as I mentioned, we spent a lot of time in part one on the culture. So that's the backdrop for every project that we run. If you come in one level or one layer, so to speak, then you get into what's called the organizational space. This really has to do with the management system, the business plans, strategies, procedures, so on and so forth. In these webinars associated with My Innovation Coach, we've spent a lot of time on these types of things. So we're not really going to deal with that in this particular webinar. But then as you keep coming in towards the individual, then you get into the team space. This is really the heart of team dynamics. And then finally, you get down to the personal space, which is at the individual level. So most of what we have done here in this three-part series is really talk about primarily these two spaces, the personal space and the team space. Of course, organizational space and culture influence team performance dramatically. So in terms of team dynamics, in the last webinar, part two, we dealt with these first two topics, elements of team performance and personal space and motivation. Today we're going to finish up with these two, but I want to go back to these two topics just to refresh your memory. In terms of team performance, we talked about three key elements of team performance: content, which is very easy to understand. This is the collateral associated with the project, the written collateral. You know, it starts off with the marketing document. Of course, as the project unfolds, there is additional content that gets developed in terms of drawings and specifications, and you know, on and on and on. The content is very easy to comprehend what that is. The other two include process and behavior, and I'll touch on those here in these next two slides. We talked about 6 key team processes, including team meetings, communications, decision making. So we discussed these 6. We spent quite a bit of time on team meetings because of the importance of them, and you know, some of the best practices associated with running meetings and so forth. And then we talked about 6 key team behaviors and what those mean to the performance, effective performance of a team. Then we moved into what motivates our behavior, and you know, what we see as behavior in individuals at work is really just the tip of the iceberg. It's really the effect, not the cause. So you have to go deeper to understand what's driving individual behavior, and it really starts with an emotion. That's the first thing that happens when we are at work. We are, you know, we cannot get around the fact that that's how we respond. The part of our brain that deals with emotions works at orders of magnitude faster than our ability to rationalize. So that's what happens first. There is an emotion, and that kicks in. And then hopefully we take time and then try to make sense of that emotion and rationalize. Of course, I could make the case that there's probably a dotted line from emotions to behavior. Sometimes if we are tired, if we are under a lot of stress at home, we act before, we behave before we really can rationalize that emotion. And of course, we've all been guilty of that. Gets us in trouble, certainly, both at home and at work. And so we all hope that we can rationalize that emotion before we actually behave. But in terms of our ability to rationalize, it really is influenced by our values, which in turn are influenced by things like our culture, where we came from, our experiences, our life experiences, how old we are, and so forth, personalities. So we spend some time on these three topics associated with how they influence our values, which goes into how we end up rationalizing. And then, of course, there's a behavior that manifests itself from that process. So I want to kind of pick up where I left off with the last time, pick up on this little mental model that I just introduced to you, and let's talk about team conflict. And so I'm going to build on that model that I just presented in the context of our overall model for team dynamics. And so now this is sitting inside of these three different spaces: the organizational space, team space, and then us as individuals. And typically what happens at work is that there will be some kind of a stimulus. Typically that comes from the organizational space, filters down through the team space to us individually. It creates some type of a stress or conflict or fear in us. And then as a result of that stimulus, then this model kicks in. We have an emotion about it, and then we behave, and that filters back out, that responds back out through those two spaces, from the personal space through the organizational team space into the organizational space. So let's talk about conflict within teams. Of course, conflicts are really unresolved disagreements between people, and of course it can disrupt our lives quite a bit. Conflict tends to cause us to behave differently than what we might normally behave. Certainly takes people outside of their normal behavior, and it can be either good or bad. There are good conflicts, and if we resolve them in a positive manner, it actually strengthens relationships. I think any of us in a work environment who have been through difficult times with folks, maybe in another functional group, we've maintained a positive attitude about it, and yes, we disagree, but we can do it in a positive manner. It actually strengthens relationships and builds us up for the next issue. Of course, bad conflicts, if they don't get resolved appropriately, or there are negative behaviors associated with it, it can be very destructive. And I think whether their conflicts get resolved positively or negatively, I think a big part of that is the culture within the organization, and that's again why I spent so much time on that to begin with. I think if the overall culture supports this type of thing, honest communication, transparency with people, and so forth, I think conflicts tend to be resolved more positively, even at the team level, if it's done within the organization in general. So in general, we all try to avoid conflict. It's not something that we like to do. I mean, in a large part, it's a fear of losing. We don't like to lose. We don't like to be in a fearful position, and that's a powerful human emotion. But there are, really three sources of team conflict that we have to consider. One is the conflict of change, one is of values, and one is of behavior. And let's talk about each of those briefly in turn. Change is something that we live within our organizations. It's just a fact of life. Not only in our organizations, but in everyday life for that matter. But in the context of work, change usually is something that comes from the organizational space. And we all go through this multi-step process to deal with a change within our work environment. This plot shows our performance as a function of time, and let's say we're at this level in terms of our performance. A change gets implemented through the organization. There tends to be a lot of uncertainty when something comes down through the organization. We might resist it, we might avoid it as our performance goes down, we might be fearful, we might worry, we might even be angry at the change that's coming out. So all this tends to be a negative effect on us, and our performance goes down. But at some point we start to analyze it. We get to a point where, you know what, we're going to have to accept it. We rationalize it. You know, again, this was our emotions kicked in here, but now we're starting to rationalize it and accept it. But then there might be, you know, another trough as we try to really figure out what that really means and adapt to it. And then finally we rise out of that and are back at our creative and productive level that we were before the change was implemented. Of course, this time scale can be short. If it's a small thing, it could be very long. You know, if you're involved with change management within the organization, it's very important to keep this in mind. This can be a long process within an organization and with individuals. I think there are some key factors if we're a project manager or we're in senior management. You know, there are some key factors that help people along this path. One is to communicate. We all like to know what's going on when it involves change. How is it going to affect us? You know, that's what we're thinking as soon as something happens within the organization. How is this going to affect my day-to-day life? We don't like these upset positions, even though it's a fact of life within our organization. We like to be involved with the change. You know, if you can involve folks either on your team or within the organization with a change, then that gives them some level of control over the situation. So these are very key factors to remember if you're a project manager or you're in senior management. I will make a point about that. In my previous life, previous work life, I was in a senior management role as well as at the project level. And so I think sometimes what happens at senior management level is within the management team, they are talking about some change, and of course the management team goes through the same process, but then the change hits the organization, so to speak, and the senior management team thinks that people are here when in fact they're back here. So I think that's a danger within management sometimes, that change gets implemented and they're off and have rationalized it, and they will tend to forget that people have to go through this process. So it's very, you know, this is really change management 101 when it comes right down to it, in terms of how you implement change within the organization and understanding how people react to it. It's very important, not only at the organization level, but again down at the team level as well. The second is a conflict of values. I mean, basically, this is when two people clash over differing values, and the fact is it's very difficult to manage that as a project manager or as an individual, because we can't readily change our values. You know, if you go back to that one slide on that mental model, our values are long range types of things that have been formed over a long period of time, related to our culture, our life experiences, our personality, all that, you know, affects our values, and those just don't change quickly, if at all. So it's difficult to manage when you have two people that really clash with their values. Teams do, you know, high performing teams use a lot of techniques to try to manage this. And again, it's really more something that the project manager needs to recognize and deal with. It may not be in the context of team meetings. It may have to be done offline with the two individuals, but certainly lots of things like discussing roundtable discussions, again, going back to our change management, to involve people and communicate and give them some level of control, that can help. The Fist of Five is a tool that we talked about in previous sessions, and just some feedback. So there are things that you can do as a project manager to help. And of course, there are all kinds of things that can lead to conflict of value between two people. Maybe, you know, ethnic humor or putting down other people's ideas. Maybe that one person is very cynical and the other is very optimistic. There are all kinds of things that can happen between people that can create this conflict of values. And then finally, as a result of conflict of change and conflict of value, then there are behaviors that result from these things. And these are interpersonal conflicts between team members. And of course, if you've ever been in a team that has experienced this type of thing, it really can negatively influence teamwork and the productivity of the team. So it's, teams can be working on the best project in the world and have the best processes, but if there are these behavioral type of conflicts, it can lead to an unsuccessful project. So lots of things that we can do, particularly at the project management level, to try to resolve these behaviors. Typically, these are going to be things that are going to be done outside of the context of the team meeting. Okay, let's then talk about managing behaviors, because that's the final step here, is that after all is said and done, that's what we're left with, is people's behaviors. You can't always necessarily change people's values and change some of the things that lead to these behaviors, but you might be left with just trying to manage them as best that you can. And so there's this concept of expanding our space, whether it's our personal space or our team space. And that means, trying to be more forgiving, more inclusive, more, less reactive, all these things, and we're going to talk about some of them here, but there are great benefits of expanding our space, whether it's at the personal level or the team level. At a personal level, it certainly creates informal power. Many people in your organization, I'm sure, that just have that aura about them of informal power. And it comes really from their ability to manage these types of situations. They tend to be very calm. They tend to be able to not overreact in situations. So if we can all take a page out of their playbook and try to manage the best we can with that, it can, for all of us, create informal power. And that's, you don't have to be a manager or a project leader to have power within the organization. So there's a great benefit expanding our personal space. Certainly helps prevent conflict, which is always a good thing. We are a team. We want to bring out the best in other people. It's a team sport, as I mentioned. It's all for one for all. So it's to our benefit to bring out the best in people within our team. And it gives us inner strength as well. It gives us that peace to deal with the stress that we have to deal with at work. Work and our home life are certainly the two big areas where stress comes in our lives. And so, expanding your space can help you actually not only at work, but in your personal life as well. So there's this concept of living above the line and below the line, and it applies both to the team and actually at the personal level as well. So now, if you're living above the line, so to speak, you are experiencing these types of behaviors. You're collaborative, you're very caring, you're patient, you're listening, you're open-minded, you're inclusive. These are upper level behaviors and help provide those benefits that we just talked about, versus living below the line, so to speak. And these are lower level behaviors where you're very resistant or controlling or impatient, you're defensive, you're closed-minded, you're letting fear get the best of you. So these are lower level behaviors that can really sap your energy, both as an individual and at the team level. So again, there are some things that we can do in the context of personal space, especially for the project manager. You can do some things to help keep people in that upper level. One thing is just recognition. It's probably the simplest and most underutilized technique. It doesn't have to be expensive. It can be very small. If somebody's really had been going the extra mile, just having them go out to dinner with their spouse can have a huge impact in terms of expanding their personal space. So recognition is important. Respect and trust, of course, this is really fundamental within the organization, and the culture permeates down to the team as well. And the other thing is, understanding that everyone, if you're a project manager, thinking about everyone wants to work on something meaningful to the organization. We talked about this actually in part one about the need to think about what the purpose of your organization is, and really at the organizational level, that's one of the big benefits is, do you just have people coming in to collect a paycheck, or do people really buy into the vision of what the company is all about? Is it more than just making money? And I think that's important. Especially, it's important today as millennials flood the workforce, that they are more motivated by that type of thing. And so, that helps keep people in this upper level behavior. And even at the team level, the project leader can do a lot of things, in terms of finding ways to build that involvement at the team. Of course, processes that we talked about in part one and part two are very important for supporting team involvement. And the project manager setting behavioral expectations. Very important that the team all understands that we stand as a team on decisions, right? It's one for all for one. We live and die as a team. All the ideas and the issues and the decisions, it belongs to the team. And so you create this team spirit, and it's a behavioral expectation as well. You listen and do not talk over people. No one dominates, everyone participates. So there are some clear expectations that the project manager should set at the very beginning with the team. And then finally, in terms of transparency, the project manager especially needs to be transparent and honest and open, and that will permeate down to will help keep that team in the upper level behaviors. Okay, so that finishes up the section on team dynamics, the four different topics that bridged from part two now to finishing up the last two parts in part three. Now I want to talk about some topics related to supporting teams. How can we support teams to be most effective within our organizations? And there are four topics I want to touch on. One is I want to start with my definition of the innovation process, because that then sets the stage for some comments I want to make about the nature of communications, which also influences considerations about physical space. And then I want to finish up with a related topic on the informal organization. So there are lots of different definitions about what innovation is. It's one of those words that if you ask 10 different people, you're going to get 10 different definitions of what it means. This is my definition, my working definition of innovation. It's really a process that mediates between two things that are happening: technology, which is typically the realm of your R&D or your development organization, and the market needs. These are the needs of the customer. Typically, this is the marketing organization or the product manager. And actually, I like to delineate here, this is the true definition of marketing, which is about the needs of the user, versus marketing communications, which is about the needs of the seller. And those are two different types of things. What we're really talking about in innovation is the marketing role, not marketing communications. Marketing communications is all about communicating to your end users or potential end users about your value proposition, but that's really after the fact. That comes after. So as far as the innovation process is concerned, we're really talking about the marketing role. Now, this might be, if you're a smaller organization, the person that's responsible for, quote unquote, the marketing role and marketing communications may be the same person, or at least within the same functional group. but they're really two distinct activities, and I like to delineate that we're talking here about the marketing role. So innovation really is about matching up a technology with a market need, and there is a time dimension to that. You might have a great technology, but if the market need is not there, then no one is willing to buy it at that particular point. So really, for me, you can have a great technology, it might be the greatest thing in the world. If no one is willing to buy it at that particular point in time, then it might be an invention, it might be a science experiment, but it's not an innovation. For me, innovation implies that it's solving some type of a market need. It's making lives better in some way. Somebody's responding to that product or service in a way that creates value. So in my mind, that's the innovation process. Now, why I start out with this in this discussion is because by its very nature, innovation requires communication and collaboration. So, and why should we care about that, about interaction and collaboration in the NPD process? Well, it's pretty simple. This is some data that comes out of this resource here. If you look at the proportion of ideas that receive really high evaluation within companies, the reality is that most of those ideas come from internal to the organization. There are ideas and things that come externally, and of course the concept of open innovation is really what's driving that, the realization that there are good ideas outside of the organization. But the reality is that the primary source of ideas about new products and services within our organization are going to come from the internal organization. So that requires close communication within the organization. And there are really 5 key things that affect technical communications, some of which we've already talked about. Of course, the formal organization structure as well as the team structure. We talked about this in part 1. That influences how communication happens, and of course, that's why it's so important to think about the type of project that you're working on and the right team structure in order to support the communication within the team. So those have a factor on technical communication. The physical structure of the facilities and the informal organization. We're going to talk about these 2 topics here coming up. And of course, human factors. We've spent the last 2 parts on this particular series talking about human factors and how that influences communication. So there are lots of things that influence it, some of which we've talked about and some of which we're getting ready to talk about. So that transitions really nicely into thinking about the nature of communications. And when it comes right down to it, there are 3 primary reasons we communicate with one another in our work environment. One is we communicate for coordination. A lot of what we do as a function of the processes and in the team processes in particular, it's all about coordinating resources. We have to manage the workflow. We have to manage different functional groups in order to get the project from the beginning to the end. So much of what we do is about coordination. If you remember back in the webinar associated with the Lean project management tool, the concept of the 15-minute daily stand-up meetings, those are very task-oriented. It's really all about coordination. Okay, so much of what we do in our day-to-day activities is about coordination. Secondly is communicating with others for information. So there might be meetings that we have, maybe core team meetings or meetings within the management team in order to update them on projects. Maybe once a month meetings that the organization might have to update the organization on the financial performance and other issues within the company. These are typically done for informational purposes, and that's important as well. But the final one that we tend to forget about, I think in many cases, is the need to communicate for inspiration. This is really about connecting dots. It's really about 2 people talking informally and suddenly arriving at a solution to a problem or combining ideas to create a whole new idea in order to solve a problem, or maybe create a new product. It's really, it's really part of the creative process. So this concept of communicating for inspiration, I think, is something that we don't tend to think about, and there are some things that we can do to help support that, and that's one of the topics we're going to talk about here. So to go along with that, to continue that discussion, is this plot shows the probability of communicating on a weekly basis versus physical separation from one another. And this is very important. So you can see that the further apart that we get from one another, the less likely we are, and by a pretty significant level, less likely we are to communicate. So this has a huge impact in our organizations in terms of our ability to communicate with one another. And if you think about it, it's also one of the big challenges why it's so difficult, especially today when you have dispersed geographical dispersed teams. That physical separation is very difficult. Now, there are a lot of great tools that we use now to help support online type communication, but at best, they can fill in. They don't take the place of face-to-face communication where you can see the other person. So the bottom line is getting people to talk is the only real effective way to transfer technical and tacit knowledge. In the world of new product development, technical information tends to be very tacit. It may not be explicit. It may reside in the heads of the people that are involved with the process, knowing what's worked in the past, that knowledge that builds up over long periods of time. It's kind of the tacit knowledge base within the organization. It's very, very important, but it's a very amorphous concept. And only by having people talk to one another can you really tap into that tacit knowledge and support it. Secondly, innovative ideas rarely come out of one person fully formed. It really takes collaboration. So again, this concept of communicating for inspiration. Third, I think there's a real danger, especially at the senior management level, to assume that the information processing needs of new product development, people involved with new product development, especially engineers, is the same as the rest of the organization. I've been in every functional group within a manufacturing organization, and new product development is by far the most complicated because of this concept of managing tacit knowledge versus managing processes that are very repetitive. So sometimes I think senior management in particular forgets that it's different. Management information is pretty easy to communicate through phone and email, but engineers really need a lot of face-to-face communication to encourage that creativity and innovation that's really the lifeblood of what we're talking about here. And so to encourage this concept of communication for inspiration, you really need to focus on how do you increase the likelihood of chance encounters. This is really the concept of how do you encourage serendipity within your organization. It's a very important part. I mean, you can't just get people in a room and say, okay, project team, you need to be more creative. This next hour that we're going to meet is meant to be creative. That doesn't work that way. So you have to find ways within the organization to encourage that outside of the formal processes and the formal meetings that we have. These chance encounters are very, very important to build this tacit knowledge that leads to innovation. And so now that transitions really nicely into this concept of thinking about the physical space, because that's one way to do this. So we've gone in our organizations from everyone having individual offices to more of the open office network with the cubes and so forth. And so this is a very much a fact of life within our organizations today. It's interesting if you think about it, this whole movement, so to speak, in terms of open office space really got started, say 20 years ago, maybe even more, as an as an outgrowth of what we just talked about in terms of this realization that the further you are from somebody, the less likely you are to communicate with them. If you happen to stand up in an open office like network like this and happen to make eye contact with somebody, 50 feet away, that might jog something in your mind that makes you go seek that person out and communicate with them. So that's what really drove this concept of the open office network or layout in organizations. I think one of the problems today, and I see it a lot. I think if you read articles and so forth, you see there's a lot of backlash to the open office networks or layouts. And I think the reason is because the concept got co-opted by senior management, particularly to focus more on the fact that it's less expensive in general to lay out an open office area than it is to build out individual offices. So I think for a lot of reasons, people do it for the wrong reason. Management does it because, hey, that's the latest thing. It allows us to pack more people into the same amount of space. We don't have as much capital expense in terms of building out space. It's less expensive. And while that is a factor, and that's a good thing in a lot of cases, it might be for the wrong reason. So if the only reason that's being done is to reduce costs, then you're really missing the benefit, because what you end up doing is creating a space that doesn't work. And I think a lot of the pushback now on some of these open office networks is that they've lost the advantages because you don't accommodate the different needs of the people within the organization. And I think that's extremely important. If you're going to lay out these open office networks, you need to think about the workflow. You need to think about the types of tasks that people are doing. You need to think about the people that are involved and involve them. Again, it goes back to that change management topic we talked about. You should involve the people that are involved in this type of a layout. I definitely believe there are differences between extroverts and introverts in terms of whether they are comfortable in these open environments or not. Depends on the workflow. I think sometimes software engineers that need a lot of really quiet, focused time, it can be detrimental to the effectiveness of their jobs. So you can lay things out to take advantage of the open networks, but give flexibility. I think that's the key thing now is providing some flexibility. Have a nearby conference room to a section of cubes that allows people to go in and have quiet time. If they need to work, focused work, have space for people to relocate. And now with our great communication tools, people can be very mobile. They can pick up their mobile device or their laptop, and with Wi-Fi networks, move anywhere within the physical space. So there are lots of things that you can do to think about how best to accommodate the workflow and the people that are involved. But the worst thing you can do is just focus on the cost implications and forget about the workflow and the folks that are going to be involved. To kind of build on that, I want to talk about this concept of functional inconvenience. And this is a building feature that appears to reduce efficiency, but actually really improves the effectiveness of communication, especially this concept of encouraging communication for inspiration. The concept can be illustrated with this diagram, where let's say you have R&D labs here. You've got a section of offices or cubicles for manufacturing engineers. In the center here is a conference room, canteen area where there might be the coffee pot, so to speak. And then here are the R&D engineers, and then here's a manufacturing lab. So what you've done is, the manufacturing folks might grumble a little bit, as will the R&D engineers. Why did you put the lab so far away from us? But what this does is here are two very important groups that need to interact with one another informally. And so what you've just done is created a reason why people might accidentally cross paths as they're moving back and forth in this space, or happen to be in this common space getting a cup of coffee. So the whole idea here is to try to find ways to encourage this communication for inspiration, having two people bump into one another and get to talking about an issue. Of course, this can even transcend individual functional groups, but at the organization level, how hallways are laid out, where you might people might accidentally connect that would not ordinarily connect with one another. So very important concept, and of course it doesn't cost you any more money when you lay out the space, but it's something that you have to really think through. And so this whole concept really is not necessarily more cost more, but it is more time consuming because it requires you to be more purposeful. The final thing I want to talk about is the informal organization. And this is very important. Of course, the formal organization, which is illustrated here, is typically how communication runs up and down through the organization through functional groups. But it's the informal communication, this person in this functional group communicating with this person in this functional group, is really where the work gets done in your organization. Senior management likes to look at the org chart, but the reality is the informal organization is really how things get done. Who knows who, and how do you support that? In a small organization, it's very easy. It's an easy thing to support. Just by the nature of the small organization, you might even be sitting right next to somebody who's in a different functional group. But as the organization gets larger, that's more difficult to do. So one concept to think about actually came out of this resource. This particular author, Chris Fusel, happened to be the aide-de-camp for General McChrystal back in the early 2000s when the military was really trying to come to grips with, the insurgency in Iraq. And how do you take a very siloed organization, the military organization, with different groups dispersed geographically around the world? How do you get them to better coordinate their activity? And so we can take the idea that came out of this reference and apply it to our organization. And the concept is what are called forums, and a way to support the informal organization. So the concept is it might be headed by the senior manager within the organization, and it combines or it involves particular gatekeepers, key people within the organization that are very well connected in the informal organization. And to have a periodic high-level meeting. It might not have anything to do with the projects that you're working on. It might be related to, say, a competitive move by one of your competitors, or a macroeconomic situation, or something to do with the industry, or maybe a big topic. Maybe it is about a big project that's happening within the organization. The whole idea is that there might be a presentation by, say, the VP of Sales about some experience in terms of competitive action or lost business or won business, and somebody within deep down in the organization, maybe even at a project level, hears this going on. A problem comes up at some point, and now they have some relationship with this person in a whole different functional group. Might be at a more senior level. It might be in a different functional group, in a different business unit or whatever. But you're forming relationships, informal relationships with people to try to improve the ability to communicate in the informal organization. So it's a very interesting concept, and I think overlays on top of the organization, the formal organization, this concept of distributed decision making. How do you take advantage of networks, and how do you encourage the informal network? And again, this all supports this concept of serendipity and communicating for inspiration. Okay, so in summary, these last three webinars have been about these 5 different topics. I introduced you to a useful mental model that you should always go back to when you, especially at the beginning of the project, and think about how the project is going to be influenced by these four different factors: the culture within the organization, the organizational space, the team space, and the personal space. Second, we talked a lot about culture. This is particularly important for senior management to understand the nature of culture within the organization. It's an amorphous concept. It's certainly not what the mission statement is. It's really, in my mind, described by the statement, this is what we do, and this is how we are expected to behave in our organization. That really, for me, captures the essence of culture, and there are some important things, 5 key factors associated with the culture that really have to be supported, including communication, open communication, mutual trust. All these kind of things are really part and parcel of the culture and filter down to the team level. So that's why it's very important to think about the culture, and you can't separate it from the effectiveness of teams because it will impact team performance. Team structure, we talked about 4 different team structures: functional teams, lightweight and heavyweight team structures, as well as autonomous teams. And the fact that different team structures are appropriate for different types of projects. Just because you've used one team structure in the past doesn't mean the next project will use the same one. And then we talked about 4 different topics associated with team dynamics. This is really about the team space and the organizational space, the 3 key factors: the content, the processes, the behaviors. These are 3 key things that influence team performance. We talked about the human factors and the personal space and behaviors and all those good things associated with team dynamics. Meetings, team meetings, how to conduct them, and some of the key best practices for meetings. And then finally, we finished up with 4 areas associated with supporting teams, particularly in terms of how do you support communication, especially communication for inspiration. And that can be related to the physical layout. It can be related to the concept of maybe using these forums to support the informal communication. Thanks for attending this My Innovation Coach training webinar.